Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Dante Topo, and I'm one of our 2 student fellows this year. More and more studies show that the contemporary generation, called the millennials, has grown increasingly disinterested in politics, less likely to vote, less likely to participate in political campaigns. So if you believe the pollsters, it comes as a surprise that so many of my peers have signed up for a talk on American politics on a Thursday night. Michael Barone is a senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner and a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Fox News Channel contributor, and co-author of the Almanac of American Politics. Along with being the principal co-author of the Almanac, first published in 1971 with new editions appearing every 2 years, Mr. Barone is also the author or co-author of 6 other books, including, but not limited to, Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan in 1990, State Legislative Elections, Voting Patterns and Demographics, Our First Revolution, The Remarkable British Upheaval that Inspired America's Founding Fathers, and Shaping Our Nation, How Surges of Migration Transformed America and Its Politics in 2013. Mr. Barone has written for many publications, including U.S. News and World Report, The Economist, The New York Times, The New Republic, National Review, and many others too numerous to enumerate here. Mr. Barone is a graduate of the Harvard College and Yale Law School. As always, audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited, and please join me in welcoming Michael Barone to the Athenaeum.
I'm still climbing the stairs here. Well, thank you very much. You said that the millennial generation is less inclined to vote. For some people on my side of the political fence, it's unfortunate that the millennial generation voted at all in some recent elections. But we believe one conservative suggested that passing a constitutional amendment barring anyone from voting who was born after the year 1980. I guess that would include most of the people in this room. As you mentioned, I've gone through a number of careers since I was at Yale Law School, before Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, by the way, but just after Jerry Brown. My career's gone from one thing to another, from one profession to another, each one tending to pay less than the one before, and in my view, sometimes having less intellectual integrity than the one before. So I've gone from law down to political consulting, and then from political consulting several notches down to journalism, not nearly as honest a profession. And sometimes I reflect that the only thing I have left is academia. I don't feel that way, however, when I'm at Claremont McKenna College. When I was, my assigned topic here is the state of American politics 2015, and I guess in some historic perspective. And when I was pondering my topic, a childhood memory came back to me. I can't recall, I don't swear that it's absolutely correct, but I think so. I remember hearing that President Eisenhower, or maybe it was President Truman, was going to deliver a State of the Union message. And I asked my mother, which state was he going to talk about? I thought the president picked a particular state for each State of the Union message. I don't recall getting a clear answer. But there's something a little interesting to me about talking about the state of American politics here in California, since in the manner of, Barry Goldwater wanted to saw the Northeast off and let it float out to sea. Current conservatives sometimes feel this way about this state. They're looking forward to the big earthquake and so forth. California has been the most populous state in the Union since 1963, and for most of my lifetime, it's voted very uncannily similar to the nation as a whole. When it became the largest state, when it got the largest number of electoral votes after the census of 1970, it was politically pivotal. He or she who carried California would carry the nation. Produced two-term Republican presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both reelected by landslide margins, the last presidents in American history elected by landslide margins. Yet California is clearly an outlier. Coming in on the plane, you can see the dotted line that sort of separates it from America. Republican presidential candidates in the last several elections have averaged 38% of its votes at a time when they've been competitive at the national level. The other interesting thing about California is that it's basically stopped growing faster than the national average. From 1850, when it was admitted to the Union, until 1990, California always grew faster than the national average. It gained House seats in every reapportionment following every census during that period. It continued growing. It's now growing just microscopically faster than the rest of the nation. You had a huge migration, internal migration, of people into California in the quarter century or so after World War II. I wrote about it in my book on internal and immigrant migration, Shaping the Nation, that came out in 2013. California was sort of the promised land for people. And that basically ended. Since 1990, internal migration has been out from California. We've had international migration in. That has been currently decreasing. When we look around for presidential candidates from California, which in the last 40 years has produced more presidential candidates than any other state, seconded by Texas, and number 3, oddly enough, is Massachusetts, which continues to present more than its share of national candidates. Well, you look for candidates, you've got Jerry Brown, who's 76 now. You have Carly Fiorina, who was at the Republican event in Iowa last month, who was ousted as CEO. California is not as central, but it's nonetheless a pleasure to be here. And I noticed that one of the public services that still works in the state is that you have effectively cleared away all your snow. So let me talk about our two political parties and try and put today's American politics in some historic perspective. We have the third oldest and third oldest parties in the world. American orators like to talk about us as a young nation, but we have very old political parties. By my count, the number 2 oldest is the British Conservative Party. And the Democratic Party dates from 1832, the Republican Party from 1854. There have been 86 Democratic and Republican national conventions starting off in 1832 and 1854. I have attended in one way, shape, or form 22 of them, going back a ways now. But they've been two different. The political parties have two basically different characters. They're not mirror images of each other, and they've held those characteristics throughout their existence. I think the political cartoonists are right to depict them as two different animals. The Republican Party, from its foundation in the 1850s, has always been a party with a core made up of people who are deemed by themselves and others as somehow being typical Americans, even though they're not the majority of people in the country. Protestant Northerners, Yankee Protestants in the 19th century, white married people today. For success, the party needs to develop a message that motivates its core and is attractive to other people. Sometimes it has succeeded in doing that, sometimes it has not. Current Republican congressional majorities and presidential candidates are trying to do something like this today. We'll see how effective they are. The Democratic Party, in contrast, has always been a coalition of of very disparate types of people. It's been a coalition of people who are deemed by themselves and others as not being typical Americans. Of course, they are good Americans anyway. White Southerners and Catholic immigrants in the 19th century, early 20th century, blacks and gentry liberals today. Gentry liberals is a term invented by my California friend Joel Kotkin. Nancy Pelosi, gentry liberals, west side of LA. You know what I'm talking about. The Democratic Party, I mean, that coalition when that coalition coheres, the Democrats can be a strong national majority party, leading the nation to success in World War II, for example. When it falls apart, it can be a disorderly rabble. I mean, the 1924 Democratic National Convention, and I do not go that far back in attending national conventions. The 1924 Democratic National Convention took 103 ballots to nominate a candidate, and it split almost evenly, something like 4 votes difference out of 2,000 votes cast on a resolution to condemn the Ku Klux Klan. The white Southerners wanted to defend the Klan. The Catholic immigrants were very much against it for understandable reasons. The party was split down the middle. It got 28% of the popular vote in that next election. 8 years later, it elected a Democratic president winning the first of 4 terms. In 2008, more recently, the Democratic coalition cohered. Democrats swept the presidential election, installed congressional supermajorities. Today, I see some signs that the coalition is coming unglued, and that its success, curiously, its success in 2016 depends almost completely at the moment on the candidacy of a figure who goes back some considerable distance in the party, who's been a public, Hillary Clinton, who's been a public figure, and whose views and impulses and record, I think, can fairly be said to be in tension with the current source of energy, elan, and enthusiasm in the party. She is identified with the ideas, policies of her husband, President Bill Clinton. The energy, enthusiasm, and elan in the Democratic Party today, I think, are on the left. One of the interesting things to me is that after more than 150 years of two-party competition, the two parties are roughly in equipoise. When I started writing, co-authoring this book, The Almanac of American Politics, we were entering a period that lasted from the presidential elections of 1968 to 88, in which Republicans won 5 of 6 presidential elections. Democrats won majorities in the House of Representatives every 2 years. Both sides seemed firmly in control of one branch of government, and political scientists, I'm not necessarily looking at anyone in this room, concocted theories about why we would just about almost always have Republican presidents and we would always have Democratic Congresses, or at least House of Representatives. There were structural reasons why this was so, and so forth, and those explanations accounted pretty accurately for the results of that 68 to 88 period. And both parties seemed to have a pretty solid lock indeed. Republicans were winning the presidency by a popular vote margin that averaged 10% of the electorate, landslide numbers. Democrats held at least 243 seats in the House, 25 more than the majority of 218. They weren't really in danger of losing a majority in the House, or so it seemed. I can remember talking to Speaker Thomas Foley, and I asked him about the complaints that the Republicans had in the House that they weren't being treated fairly or given procedural opportunities to prevail on legislation. He said, look, we have elections every 2 years. We have one in each one of the 435 congressional districts. All they have to do to get rid of their complaints is to win in 218 or more of those districts. Well, in fact, that's what happened. If the Republicans had a lock on the presidency and the Democrats had a lock on the House of Representatives, within 2 years, Bill Clinton picked one lock and Newt Gingrich picked the other. And since then, the balance has been sort of in the other direction, to the consternation of the people that came up with theories why we must always have the Republicans in the White House, the Democrats in Congress. And to some extent to the combobulation of Republicans and conservatives that concocted theories of executive supremacy, and the liberals who concocted theories about why Congress should always prevail in fights between the two branches of government. Democrats, as you know, have won 4 of the last 6 presidential elections, won a popular vote plurality in the 5th, in the calendar year 2000. It occurs to me that most students today didn't stay up till 5 o'clock in the morning in 2000 election night. How many students stayed up to see who won the 2000 election? Anybody in the audience? Okay. I was at Fox News headquarters in New York and was on the air, and Brit Hume at one point, when we didn't know what was happening, said, he said, you know, it was 2 o'clock in the morning or something. He said, Mike, this can go on all night. We may not know who wins till the end of the night. I said, Britt, this could actually take 3 to 4 days to be decided. Well, it took, 36 days to be decided, the presidential election. But it's an emblem of how close the competition it's one example, not the only one, of how close the competition between the two parties has been. On the congressional side, starting in 1994, Republicans have won majorities to the House in 9 out of 11 elections. That's after losing 20 straight from 1954 to 92. They have won 9 of 11 from 1994 to 2014. Note that neither party's hold on the branch where it currently has the advantage is as strong as the other party's hold was in the 1968 to 88 period. The Democrats have won the presidency most of the time, starting in 92. Their popular vote margin has averaged 4% of the electorate, rather than 10% for the Republicans in that early period. And Republicans, up to the 2014 election, their best showing in the House of Representatives was 242 seats. That's one fewer than the Democrats won in every election from 1958 to 92. Now, in the 2014 election, they exceeded that percentage, that number, and they went up to 246 seats in the House. And they went up to 247. It went down to 246 because the Republican reelected in Staten Island was under indictment and resigned. So this is what happens when you have a congressman from Staten Island. Anyway, kind of thing happens. In any case, the Republicans in the Congress now are left with their strongest position that they've had really since the 1920s. 246 or 247 seats in the House. There'll be a special election in Staten Island on that seat. 54 Senate seats are just one below the 55, which is the maximum they've held since going back to the 1930 election. So that's, and if you look at state legislative races around the country, you find that Republicans are in their strongest position that they've been in since the 1920s, more state legislative seats than they've had. And this is that's a big shift. Even in California, the Democrats lost their veto-proof majorities in their two-thirds majorities that enabled them to propose constitutional amendments and the like in the elections here. They don't seem to be in danger of losing their majorities, however. So the fact is, you hear some pundits and people decrying we have divided government, we can't govern, nothing can ever work, there's inevitable gridlock. Divided government has been the fact in Washington for 70% of the time since 1968, since before most of the people in this room were born, well before. It's divided in the sense of having a president of one party and a majority of at least one House of Congress in the hands of the other party. It's been the norm, not the exception. In that earlier 1968 to 88 period, it was the result of extensive ticket splitting, most prominently by white Southerners who were voting for Republicans for president, but were still voting for Democrats because, the Civil War, those Civil War loyalties lasted a long time. My paternal grandmother was from West Virginia, and in the 1944 election against Franklin Roosevelt against Thomas Dewey, my father asked his grandfather why he was voting for Dewey, the Republican. And his grandfather was astonished that he would ask such a ridiculous question. He said, "That's easy." He said, "The Confederates burned our barn." It was only 80 years before. He was still voting against the Confederacy. A lot of white Southerners were still voting against Lincoln and the Union. And that continued, for a very long time. One of the fascinating things that's happened now, and it's fascinating in particular because we continue to have divided government, we have very little ticket splitting. If you go out and interview voters in your shopping malls around this area, you will find that many of them will say, well, you know, I don't vote for a party, I'm independent, and so forth. Most of them are lying these days. Most voters vote for all Republicans, all Democrats. In the 2012 presidential election, there were only 26 of the 435 congressional districts voted for president of one party, House member of the other party. That's the lowest number by far since 1920. That's a period where basically people are voting for one party, and the lowest number since 1920. So that's we are increasingly a non-ticket splitting, a straight party voting country, but we're closely enough divided that we end up producing at the national level Democratic presidents, Republican houses of representatives. Now, how does that come about? Well, one of my theses is that Americans most often throughout the years have been divided politically, not so much along economic lines as along cultural lines. That goes against much of the political science that I was taught in college. People analyzing the New Deal said, well, the rich vote for Republicans, the poor vote for Democrats, you know, the union workers vote for the Democrats, people in management vote for the Republicans. I grew up in the state of Michigan where, you know, politics seemed to be a battle between the big three auto companies and the United Auto Workers Union. Two of the three have since gone bankrupt, and the UAW has lost 3/4 of its members. But that was the politics in Michigan when I was growing up. And it looked like economic politics. And in fact, that was what I consider to be something of an unusual case in American history. Economic divisions have always played some part in our politics. And I think in that post-New Deal period and in some of the states that had the big industrial unions like Michigan, they played a critical part for a time. But I think the more usual thing is for Americans to be split along cultural lines. And I mean by racial lines, I mean by regional lines. The South has always voted very differently from the North. Ethnic lines, along lines of your views on moral principles and issues of that sort that come into politics and that may increasingly come into politics as government becomes larger and ends up taking a stand, one side or the other, on moral issues. People who have strong feelings on both sides may feel obliged to enter the political fray and to become important determinants of which party, of party politics. Over the past 20 years, in this period I've been describing as one of close competition between the two parties, the demographic variable most highly correlated with voting behavior is religion, or a degree of religiosity. Within each sectarian group, the more religious tend to vote Republican, the less religious or secular tend to vote Democratic. That has been a pattern that we see in groups of all kinds and across the country. The particular political issue that's most wholly correlated with voting behavior these days has been the abortion issue. In the up through the middle 1960s, abortion wasn't an issue, it was a crime. Then states started to legalize it. In 1973, the Supreme Court essentially legalized abortion without substantial limits in every state. That issue at that time split the parties. In my home state of Michigan, the leading supporter of abortion rights was the Republican governor, William Milliken, a graduate man who owned a local department store and was a graduate of Yale. That was your pro-choice side. The leading abortion opponent, the pro-life side, if you will, was John William A. Ryan, Speaker of this House of Representatives, Democrat, labor union backer, lived in Detroit next door to a nunnery and attended 7 a.m. Mass. Those were your abortion opponents. In the 20 years or so since Roe v. Wade basically the abortion issue kind of took over in determining which party you were on. By 1992, Bill Clinton is nominated by the Democrats. The pro-life or abortion opponent, governor of Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, is not allowed to give a speech at the Democratic National Convention. I actually went up with the late Bob Novak, climbed up that. They had seated Bob Casey in the Pennsylvania delegation way up there, and we had to climb up some of the rafters there and interviewed him about not being able to speak at the convention. That was a thing, and abortion is now, in large part, a litmus test for both parties, to the extent that I don't think you're going to hear about it very much in the primaries, because there's not going to be much difference among the various large number of Republicans running and the rather smaller, perhaps no more than one, number of Democrats running. They're basically, it's a determining issue. And it seems it is, it's interesting. Opinion on the abortion issue has not basically changed. Young voters are slightly more anti-abortion than older voters, according to public opinion surveys. The difference is not big. The sonogram generation is perhaps a way to explain what the difference is. Every American born since 1973 can be seen as a survivor of abortion, if you will. Mother did not choose to have life ended before birth. It's now a behavior that most Americans don't want abortion criminalized again. Those who want to see that happen are going to be disappointed. Most Americans do favor restrictions on abortion, which are being voted in large numbers in many, many states, not all. And we've essentially got a legal thing where abortion is sort of like cigarette smoking. It is disfavored, not fashionable, but it is legal and permitted. Democrats, why do we get this split of, what are the factors that give us this split between the Republicans doing well in congressional races and Democrats doing better in presidential races? I think the main explanation is demographics. Americans, as I say, tend to vote straight tickets, and yet it's clear that the Republicans have an advantage in House races, Democrats in presidential races. I think the legislative districting is one reason for this. I think it is a marginal factor that helps Republicans. What really determines it is demographics. Heavily Democratic groups of voters, blacks, Hispanics in many states, gentry liberals, university town people, tend to be clustered in by large percentages in many central cities, sympathetic suburbs, and university towns. You will find many neighborhoods that are 80 to 90% Democratic there. Republicans are spread more evenly around the rest of the country. That's the basic factor. So you see Barack Obama carrying 26 congressional districts with 80% or more. Mitt Romney carried only one by that percentage. And by the way, it wasn't in Utah, it was in West Texas. Those clustering of Democratic voters helps Democrats in the Electoral College. It basically, in recent elections, has given Democrats 170 safe electoral votes that they don't have to worry about or really campaign in. Republicans, by way of contrast, have only about 105 safe electoral votes. So that's a definite advantage for the Democratic Party. They need to win a smaller number of a smaller share of the contested seats in order to win. But when you switch to districts, you suddenly see that Republicans have the advantage. Obama carried the Electoral College 332 to 206. Pretty solid margin. 47 of those votes were by close votes in Florida and Ohio, but hey, he carried them, 332 to 206. But if you count congressional districts, and Republicans did not have the sense to change the Constitution to require the president be elected by congressional districts. Obama carried only 209 congressional districts. Mitt Romney carried 236. In a straight ticket voting era, that means Republicans have the advantage in all those 236 districts, and in fact, that's almost precisely the number that they won in 2012. They won 234. So I think that, and that also accounts for Republican strength in presidential elections. So we've got this nation divided narrowly. And then we had a period when we suddenly find a big advantage to the Democratic Party. It happened in proportion, along the lines suggested by John Judas and Roy Teixeira in their 2002 book, The Emerging Democratic Majority. That majority, in fact, pretty much the shape that they predicted, emerged in 2006 and 2008. And I think, in my view, thanks in large part to disorder in the streets of Iraq, disorder in the streets of New Orleans, a sense that things were spinning out of control under the Republicans, that they weren't performing carefully. The Democrats' campaign chairman, Rahm Emanuel, for the House, Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and Rahm Emanuel is about to be reelected mayor of Chicago. He's got 3 opponents. The vote is going to be 1,000,000 to 1 to 1 to 1, but no, he's going to win. They ran candidates adapted to local terrain, Democrat, the blue dogs in the South and border states, and sort of moderate candidates in suburban districts and so forth, who were able to capture districts that had been voting pretty safely Republican. That Bush had won just 51% of the vote for re-election in 2004. His strategist Karl Rove had been predicting an enduring Republican majority. You don't really build an enduring Republican or Democratic majority off a 51% win usually. But the Democrats also got a kind of star candidate in 2008. John Kerry, the 2004 nominee, gave the keynote speech to Barack Obama, who in 17 minutes made himself a national figure even while he was still an Illinois state senator. And I think that, on balance, I think that he benefited by the fact that, in my judgment, a large majority of Americans believed that, as an abstract proposition at least, it would be a good thing for America in light of its history to elect a black president. You got some voters, Mr. Obama himself has said, you got some voters who would never vote for a black for president. You've also got some voters, as he said, who would be attracted to vote for a black candidate who would probably not vote for him otherwise. My view is that the second group was larger than the first group. That's not something I can prove. Others take a different view. In any case, Democratic coalition held together, and it won the presidency with 53 to 46. That's the same margin, rounded off numbers, as the first George Bush in 1988, or for that matter, Franklin Roosevelt in 1944. And the Democrats went and got to work and passed much of their wish list of issues. They passed a stimulus package, which increased domestic discretionary spending, budget categories. It sent a lot of money to state and local governments, about 1/3 of its money, to preserve in large part jobs of public employee union members, who, of course, whose dues actually go help Democrats and whose work helps Democrats get elected. You had the feminist groups saying there that they did not want to see infrastructure jobs of, quote, burly men, unquote, getting those preferences. They wanted it to go to public employees who were more likely to be women. We had the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's often called. We had cap and trade legislation passed in the House, which would have a big effect on energy production. Did not pass in the Senate, since that depended on the legislative talents of Barbara Boxer, but it did antagonize a certain number of Democrats, and we eventually got higher taxes on high earners as a result of the various budget maneuverings of the first Obama term going into the second Obama term. And I think President Obama and the Democrats were acting on the assumption, widespread assumption, that in times of economic distress, Americans would be more supportive of or amenable to big government policies. That's a lesson taught by the best-selling and beautifully written New Deal historians and their books. He was already told by Franklin Roosevelt himself. I took those New Deal books were bestsellers in their time, really shaped opinion. I took a different view in my book, Our Country, The Shaping of America, from Roosevelt to Reagan. A recent look at Amazon showed that you could get a copy for 11 cents. My argument was that the New Deal big government policies became unpopular after the 1936 election when people saw the results in practice, when they saw violent sit-down strikes, which, contrary to labor union celebrators of labor union memories, were unpopular, widely unpopular at the time, though they were effective in getting union representation in the auto and steel industries. You had bureaucratic bloat of various kinds, welfare work. The terms leaf raking and boondoggle were invented in that period. Young people can Google those after this presentation and see what they are referring to. You had a serious recession in 1937, and that Amity Shlaes has written about in her book, The Forgotten Man, when you seem to have what some of the president's admirers and his opponents described as a capital strike, businesses not creating jobs because of uncertainty about whether they'd have higher taxes and more stringent regulations. Sounds something like recent years, in my view. And in fact, you had a sluggish economy, to say the least. Now, President Roosevelt was reelected. Democrats won 5 presidential elections in a row, and that's taken by many people as an endorsement of the big government policies of the New Deal. I think that's a partial explanation, but if you look at the 1940 and 44 elections, those were elections President Roosevelt won on foreign policy and as a leader in wartime. I mean, in 1940, you had a situation in the world where Hitler and Stalin were allies under the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and with their allies, Italy and Japan, they were in the process of taking over the landmass of Eurasia. We were as close in world history as we have ever been to the vision of George Orwell's 1984. That's what he had in mind, what was happening in 1940. And in that situation, Americans felt the world was in terrible shape and in danger, and they voted for a seasoned leader, President Roosevelt, over the quite smart and attractive Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee, who had been an executive on a utility company. And in fact, Roosevelt, as I would go on, was reelected in 1944 as a war leader. In my view, he was a terrific war leader. President Truman in 1948 was reelected in part, if you go back and look, on farm policy. The Democrats charged the Republicans would get rid of farm subsidies, but also foreign policy. President Truman, and this was his personal decision, was resisting communism and proving at the same time that America was both strong and good by supporting and insisting on the Berlin airlift when Stalin cut off access to Berlin from the West. Those were victories in many ways of foreign policy, and I think they put a cloud on the title of saying that Americans were just voting for big government. I think that it was it's a more mixed record, and in any case, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I think that view has been, to a considerable extent, vindicated by events of the last 5 and 6 years. I think President Obama and Democratic congressional leaders did not expect the stimulus package to be unpopular. They thought it would be popular. It wasn't, isn't. They didn't campaign on it in 2012, 14. They expected Obamacare, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, to be popular. Hey, we're giving you what Mitt Romney infelicitously called free stuff. Most voters don't like it. Look at the Kaiser Family Foundation polls, and it's a foundation that tends to support that kind of legislation. They've got some honest polling, and it's never been supported by majorities. People are unhappy with it in various ways, and I think it must be puzzling to the framers of that bill, who sort of thought, well, we're throwing subsidies at people. They're bound to like it. They don't. They have a certain mistrust of it. And we've seen this results politically. We did have the president reelected with 51% of the vote. He's the only American president in history to be reelected with a smaller percentage than he won 4 years before. He had superior organization, general satisfaction at that time with foreign policy. It's not really there anymore. The tepid recovery and so forth The assist from Hurricane Sandy, did that get him an extra point? I don't know, possibly. In any case, he won that election unambiguously. But basically, the Democrats have gotten clocked in the elections of 2010, 2012, and 2014 for the House of Representatives. They finally lost the Senate in 2014 when the Republicans didn't manage to nominate as many clownish candidates as they had in the two previous Senate cycles, who lost races they should have won. And it's, I think that the big government policies, I think, have surely been a disappointment to their progenitors. They expected these to be popular. They're not. And what didn't happen is that that emerging Democratic majority that John Judas and Roy Teixeira correctly predicted, and which occurred 2006, 2008, didn't prove to be permanent, as some commentators, including National Journal's Ronald Brownstein, who's a very smart guy, but whom I disagree with on this, they thought it would be permanent. Their reckoning was, look, you've got two segments of the electorate which are bound to be larger segments of the electorate as time goes on: Hispanics, millennials. They voted 67%, 66% for Obama in 2008. You put those kind of numbers and you assume that they're going to be a larger percentage of the electorate, and hey, the people we currently classify as white have never voted as much as 60% Republican. That means that we're going to have an eternally Democratic government, and Democrats basically winning just about every election, unless they sort of massively screw up. Well, that's not really happened. The Obama millennial margin fell from 66% to 60% in 2012. That's the biggest drop of any age group. And 2014, it was down to 54%. One way to compare it is this. If you look at the 2008 election, the vote among millennials only the margin for Obama amounted to 7% of the total electorate. The margin for Obama generally was 7% of the total electorate. That's a big margin to get from one age group. Millennials' margin for Democrats, for House Democrats in the 2014 election, amounted to 1.5% of the total electorate. That's not nearly as large a margin. Now that would amount, if you increase the size of that group as a percentage of the electorate, in light of the fact that they're more likely to turn out in the presidential year than the non-presidential year, that goes up from about 1.5% to about 2%. It doesn't get close to 7%. That's a big difference. A party can survive losing an age group by that margin, particularly if they carry the other age groups by a similar margin. Hispanics, we go back, the baby boomers voted 50-50 in the Nixon-McGovern election when the rest of the country was 63% Nixon. They were much more heavily Democratic than the electorate. What we see in the baby boom generation now is they voted for Mitt Romney last time. So early views sometimes have influence on people over the years, don't always. And the other group, I think, is Hispanics. Ron Brownstein likes to talk about people of color. I think that's a misleading way of looking at it. In most elections, Hispanic percentages are closer to white percentages for either party than to black percentages. Asian percentages have wobbled around. The exit poll says 71% of Asians voted for Obama in 2012, and the Asians voted 50-49 for Republicans for the House this last time. I don't believe either number. The exit poll is not designed to give you accurate numbers within a reasonable error margin for groups of that size, for reasons I can get into if anyone's interested. So I don't think that tells us much. As for Hispanics, Obama did very well with them in 2012. Due fact that Mitt Romney was talking about his infelicitously referred to self-deportation. I mean, the irony is that that's actually been going on. You know what the net migration from Mexico to the U.S. 2007-2012 was? 0. That's according to the Pew Hispanic Center, built on U.S. and Mexican statistics. The migration has gone way down among Latin immigrants. result, I think about a third of foreclosures in the United States in the 2007 to 10 period were on Hispanics that had gotten these loans, in many cases because of racial quotas and preferences to lenders that ended up ill-serving the intended beneficiaries. But basically, what you see with Hispanics, interestingly, they're different in different states. Coastal California, hugely Democratic. Central Valley, somewhat less so. In Texas, they're pretty close to 50-50 between the two parties in Texas. John Cornyn carried Hispanics, according to the exit poll, 49-48. Greg Abbott, the candidate for governor, lost them by, I think, 48 to 44. By that time, the Hispanic, by that pace, the Hispanic percentage will make Texas a Democratic state in the year 2352. It's going to be a long time, and maybe other events will occur in the meantime that will render all these calculations moot. You see much closer races with Hispanics in Florida, Georgia, Kansas. Interestingly, Colorado. That's the one of the 2014 Senate race target states and presidential 2008 and 12 target states, which had a large Hispanic percentage. And what's interesting there, Obama carried them over Mitt Romney, according to the exit poll, 75-23, 52 points. Again, there's an error margin on that, but that's overwhelming. If you look at that Senate race, it looks like Mark Udall, the Democratic senator, incumbent, a person with an attractive personality and personal record, doesn't seem to have carried them by more than 10%. What was going on with Hispanics? Well, you had, Udall was running what I call an abortion absolutist campaign. Half his ads were on the so-called war on women, and he was talking about, rejected any limits on abortion. That's a minority position in Colorado, as it is in America. And it's not an issue that's really a front row center issue, I submit, for Hispanic voters. Jobs and education are their top issues. Immigration is of some concern. Abortion's a lot lower on the scale. You had gun control. Well, one of the two state senators, Democrats, recalled for the gun control measure in California was a woman named Angela Giron from Pueblo County, which is 42% Hispanic. Apparently, Hispanics want the right to bear arms. The Colorado Democrats proposed, but not carried through, ballot measure. They yanked it from the ballot to ban fracking. Some of the Hispanics may be less concerned about protecting gay and more concerned about getting a job. In any case, I think that's some of the evidence that the Democratic coalition is coming apart, as it has in the past, and is almost, for a party that is made up of coalitions of very disparate groups that have different concerns and different issues, it's difficult to hold them all together for a while. I mean, we can look down on the Democrats and say, well, gee, they weren't very smart. They weren't able to hold these different groups together. It's actually kind of hard to do. And you have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of things that you can emphasize. And some groups are going to be more concerned than others, and some of them are going to be opposed on some issues than others. And I think we're seeing increasingly that the Democratic Party, the energy and elan of the Democratic Party is now on the left. And why has this happened? Well, I have concocted a theory that I have not seen in the political science literature, but which I may have missed, and perhaps someone in the room more versed in it than I can point out to me what I've missed it. But my theory is that in the second term of a party's presidency, usually, the wingers get restless. The left-wingers in the Democratic Party, the right-wingers in the Republican Party. And there's some natural reasons why this should be so. On the one hand, the goals that their party and their party's president has accomplished that they like have been accomplished. So they're taking those for granted. And some other goals that they have not been accomplished. They were shoved aside. They regret the goals that were not established. They have fears that their next side may lose the next election. I mean, we've only had one election in the last, 65 years or so that a party has won the presidency 3 times in a row. So they're afraid they're going to lose the next election. I think we saw this kind of restless right-wingers in the Republican Party And they came forward also, we saw it during the last part of the Bush administration, and we saw it in the Tea Parties. A lot of their complaints, the Tea Party people, were complaints against George W. Bush and his administration as much as they were about Barack Obama. And so you still hear them talking about that, and when they're angry about things like immigration, the Common Core education thing, they bring these up against Jeb Bush. They're also talking about things that are at least similar to policies of George W. Bush, things that were not accomplished that they don't like. Left-wingers in the Democratic Party now are talking about expanding Social Security. They're talking about vastly higher taxes on high earners. They're talking about breaking up the big banks, which I think is actually kind of a good idea. They're talking about, and we saw some of this in President Obama's budget, we're talking about free community college. Turns out for the lower half of the income scale, community college is already free. So we're helping people in the upper half of the income scale. I don't think, well, part of it is that, you get down to the point where some of your policy proposals are not very well thought out. And you've got a slogan that sounds good, and the particulars that people look at them are really not so defensible. But, in the operation we're in, President's not in any danger of having Congress pass his policy, so he's not going to have to live with the consequences. So maybe that's okay, and it sounds good to say free community college. The fact is, though, that when you look at, if you start taking these policies seriously, you're not going to be able to find enough money among the rich to finance them. You're going to have to increase taxes on the middle class. And we saw the president withdraw his proposal to tax withdrawals from 529's college savings accounts with Nancy Pelosi, who represents a gentry liberal district in San Francisco, and Chris Van Hollen, a very smart Democrat who's the ranking member of the Budget Committee, represents a gentry liberal district in Montgomery County, Maryland. They both went to him and said, hey, you can't do this. They were hearing some of it for their constituents, and they were reflecting the views of Democratic colleagues who were hearing it as well. The rich can protect themselves against higher taxes in many cases by arranging their affairs accordingly. The middle class has to protect themselves from high taxation by how they vote at the ballot box. If we go back to the Reagan years, we see high-income people voting heavily against Democrats who wanted to raise taxes and called for it, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis. The left-wing Democrats would put themselves in that position again. I don't think that we'd see the same patterns as the 1980s, but there is the possibility of disassembling further some of that Democratic coalition. Let me just note in addition, and despite Obamacare and despite the lamentations that are sometimes printed in the Claremont Review under the name of Charles Kessler, that in some senses, I think power is flowing inexorably out of Washington and towards the states and the citizenry, to an extent that's not generally appreciated, that's not highlighted in the partisan arguing that we hear or in the journalistic coverage. Think about this sequester agreement to hold down federal domestic spending. This is a proposal that was suggested by aides to the president. He said correctly in his budget statement that he doesn't like it, the Republicans don't like it, the incoming Secretary Ashton Carter certainly doesn't like it. The president said it's mindless. It is. In fact, you're reducing everything by 1 point, and you're not even making adjustments to the budget in light of changing needs of programs, which are arguably there at any time. But we've had what the Keynesian economist, Paul Krugman called austerity, lower spending. Did you hear much squawking from the voters about that? I really didn't hear any. I don't see it in the public opinion data. We want more government spending. Bring back the stimulus. Not the dog that isn't barking. Unemployment benefits at the end of last year were cut back from 99 weeks to 26 weeks, varying degrees in varying states because they were different lengths in different states. Again, no vast protest. We did see some increase in jobs. There is, general agreement among economists that unemployment insurance deters some people from getting jobs because looking for a job when you're unemployed is a real unpleasant thing to do, and if you can avoid it for a little while or wait for a job that's more suited to your needs, maybe unemployment insurance will help you do that. It's an argument for the policy as well as against it. On the other hand, clearly, this did not produce a vast protest out there. Welfare reform and crime control, two major, mostly conservative, but also in important ways bipartisan policy reforms in the 1990s, were really forged out of Washington by the states and the cities. Washington was a latecomer, an occasional a bystander, an occasionally helpful bystander, as I put it in this period of this. That's mostly been left in place, even by the New York's left-wing mayor, Bill de Blasio. On transportation spending, this is a major source of government spending. Washington has basically given up on raising the gas tax. Gas usage, gas tax revenues are inexorably going down because, among other things, other government policies discourage gasoline usage by increasing the mileage requirements and so forth and encouraging alternative fuels. What's happening is that states, localities are building roads and bridges. Public-private partnerships, they're experimenting with these. This is common practice in Australia. It is catching on here. In my home city of Detroit, the new Detroit River Bridge is being built by a public-private partnership in which the public financing is coming exclusively from the Dominion of Canada. That's a result of, among other things, the Congress some time ago passed a bill, in the 70s, passed a bill that's saying bridges between the U.S. and Canada are negotiated by state governors and the Canadian government. And so this was Rick Snyder's doing. It had nothing to do with the Obama administration. So I think, in some ways, the initiative is going outwards. And I think that the results of the Obama administration have, to many extent, discredited the cause of big government and the argument that big government can help you at least as much as the perceived successes of the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal convinced Americans that big government will work. I've argued that one of the reasons for that was that Roosevelt was an absolute genius at picking the right person to get things done. He made big government look a lot easier than it is for lesser mortals. But this is, in any case, I think that's a problem. I think what should the Republicans do? What are they in the process of doing? Well, the Republican Party, as I've said, is a kind of a different animal. It is a party that has to find policies acceptable to its core, which rules out certain things, but which are also saleable to a wider public, because the Republican core is not big enough to win elections in a two-party political system like the United States. And I think, they've been given a leg up by the unpopularity and the unworkability of Obamacare, which the administration itself has actually revised and changed 46 times. One of those times is being challenged now in the King v. Burwell case, and if the Supreme Court rules that the legislation says what it says, at least that's how I'd put it, the legal issue in that case, there are going to have to be major changes in Obamacare, and both the Republicans will be under pressure to preserve subsidies to people in certain states, but Democrats will also be under pressure to save what they can of the architecture of the act. It's going to be a situation where clarity on public policy and bargaining ability are going to be tested on both sides. Looking back at previous things, I don't see high bargaining ability on the part of the president. I don't necessarily see it among the Republicans either. I think that the Republican presidential candidates will have to shape policies and platforms. And so I think that's the challenge that we face for 2016. It's the challenge. Democrats face the challenge of assembling their coalition, apparently with a candidate who is in tension with the sources of energy and enthusiasm in the party. That it presents some difficulties. Republicans' challenge is to try to find policies acceptable to the core, but popular, and I think most important of all, policies that actually work, policies that are successful governing policies. Roy Teixeira and John Judas, Karl Rove, and others have talked about creating permanent majorities, permanent governing majorities for one party after another. I think what our two parties can hope to achieve in this equipoised political contest is not enduring party majorities, because they will vanish soon enough, but enduring public policy that is accepted by the public as workable, as beneficial, as in line with the things. You don't expect public policy to last forever. The Homestead Act was effective public policy. It's not a big feature of the policy landscape anymore. You do see some policies staying in place a long time. Social Security for 80 years, though it's now in trouble. The Taft-Hartley labor law for nearly 70 years. 67 years. That's enduring public policy. So I think the Republicans need to think about not only how to win an election and to try to win it, as the Democrats did in 2008, but also how to make effective and enduringly successful public policy, which I would submit most Americans think the Democrats have not done in the years since 2008. So that's where I see the state of politics in 2015. Thanks for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
We will now have time for questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and either Shannon or I will come by with the microphone. As always, preference goes to students, and since we do have limited time, I urge you to limit yourself to one question so everyone gets a chance.
Thank you so much for your speech. This question is geared towards your opinion on fiscal policies. So you wrote an article about the housing market, the housing crash, how that was catalyzed by the No Income, No Jobs and Assets Act, and encouraging subprime mortgage lending by the government.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so you mentioned how, although it was well-intentioned, it actually devastated the economy. So I'm wondering what you think, what makes some fiscal policies work and some don't?
Well, in mortgages and house granting, we had, a long history of policies that basically worked. You require people to put a certain amount of money down on a mortgage, 10% or 20%. We have 30-year mortgages in this country, which is longer than most countries. It means your monthly payments are lower. So that's been partly by government intervention. A lot of that government policy worked. Some of the government policy we wanted rightly to get rid of. The FHA under Roosevelt said we shouldn't lend to people to buy in all Negro neighborhoods because you don't want to live near Negroes. Well, that's not the kind of public policy we want, obviously. But you basically got partly through the Community Reinvestment Act, which goes back to the 1970s, and then, as my AEI colleague Peter Wallison wrote in his book, Hidden in Plain Sight, 1992 Act that basically empowers Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to make a whole lot of money by encouraging the granting of mortgages to minorities under conditions that are not good. And the people in charge of Fannie Mae, Jim Johnson, whom I've known for years, a former aide to Walter Mondale, was the head of Fannie Mae for 7 years, CEO. He got a salary based in part on whether or not they made their financials and did the stock go up and how many mortgage-backed securities were they creating and doing this and that. Jim made $120 million in 7 years, which is pretty good money for government work. Frank Raines made $90 million in 6 years. They were incentivized to put a lot of junk mortgages out, and they did, and we saw what happened. And if you want to find out, check the property history of an awful lot of property within a 20-mile radius of where you're sitting right now. And you will see, particularly a lot of Hispanic homeowners, and people, well, we don't need to see, they'd say this in Spanish, we don't need to see no W-2s. That's a superstition. You're out on the corner at 7 a.m. getting construction work. We know you can service this $600,000 no money, $300,000 no money down mortgage. And by the way, it'll be worth $600,000 in a couple of years, so you'll be rich. Well, that was disaster. And that stuff was sent through the financial things and through other government regulations. It's an illustration that Republicans or Democrats should not be either for, it's not enough to say you're for regulation or you're against regulation. What kind of regulation you have? Good regulation or bad regulation? We were seeing that the effect of bad regulation. Regulation that incentivized behavior that poisoned the financial system. And, we can go into more details about the rating services regulations and things which are government regulations. It's not free market. And you could look at, and good regulation, which we have seen in much American home legislation over the last 70 years.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have two questions for you. First of all, I wanted to push you a little bit on your claim that more power is going to begin to flow towards state and local governments, which I agree with you. We've seen, I think, especially in this presidential election, the popularity of Scott Walker and other governors and their ability to push their own agendas. But it seems like you also pushed away the notion of ballot initiatives in the last election, which, if anything, I think proved the popularity of a number of issues. While I agree with you on, I think it may have proven how moderate most of America is on issues like abortion, which I feel they probably are more moderate than your own rather out of touch opinions on the issue. They seem to back ideas like raising the minimum wage or the legalization of marijuana or gay marriage or these other issues which are rather contrary to the Republican platform. And so I wanted to know how you reconcile those. And my second question is regarding, as long as we're talking about the state of American politics, it seems like for at least most of us, when we think about the state of American politics, we think about the role of money in Washington, D.C. and
most people don't think about the role of money.
I think most do. We've had a number of speakers here, Tom Daschle, John Huntsman, and others who have talked about the effect that it's had on Congress and the fact on its impact on decision making. So I wanted to know how you feel that's impacted Washington and the policies that are being enacted.
Okay, well, raising the minimum wage, you can always get a 70% answer like that. It's just like, a guy standing in the corner and saying, give me some money for a cup of coffee, we'll get some money after a while. It's not an issue people care about, it's not an issue people think about, it's a freebie. If the Democrats the Democrats never index the minimum wage to inflation, do they? No, because they want the issue again and again and again and again. It's cynical politics, it means nothing. What I think is interesting is it means nothing about general policy characteristics or tendencies. What I think is interesting is I have seen a push towards libertarianism but restraint on a set of three issues, two of which are identified with the left, I guess, and one with the right. That I think has happened in this generation that's very different from the America I grew up in as a child in the 1950s. And we've seen this in referenda, among other things, which you made some reference to. One of them is marijuana. We've had 3 states vote for legalization. We've had medical marijuana dispensaries. The map of medical marijuana dispensaries on the west side of Los Angeles overlaps pretty closely with the map of unvaccinated children. The same people. Interesting. You can look it up. We've had some success. We've had a change in that. Gun rights. We've had carry concealed weapons now that one has been forced through in Illinois. Are really taking laws in all 50 states, contrary to the predictions of many people, including me. When the first one was passed in Florida in 1987, we don't see people getting out of their cars with guns, shooting each other off over traffic altercations and stuff like that. All that, it turns out that, curiously enough, responsible citizens behave like responsible citizens. And, oh, by the way, Illinois now has carry concealed weapons, and suddenly crime in Chicago, which was a big murder capital, is way down. Maybe that had something to do with it. And the third one is same-sex marriage, which has been, which was voted against in referendums, which we've had a huge movement of public opinion in favor, and which there's a big difference between, the elderly. I mean, 5 years ago, I would have said elderly voters' attitude towards same-sex marriage is, the millennials, young voters, the same-sex marriages, well, yeah, and so forth. We've seen a movement towards that latter thing. So that, California voted 52 to 48 against same-sex marriage in 2008. How many think that result would be duplicated today? I mean, wouldn't even be close, come on, and so forth. So, that's been a big change. In each case, though, it's a movement towards liberation as compared to the 1950s, when marijuana was a crime, illegal, when majority of public wanted to ban handguns. Richard Nixon wanted to ban handguns, and in which homosexual behavior was illegal, a crime. Very different. But each also contains an idea of restraint, of self-restraint, restraint by others. The marijuana states are now grappling with, and Governor Hickenlooper, the Democratic governor of Colorado, has had some problems with this. What do you do about a 7-year-old eating a heavily laced marijuana brownie? That's a problem. It's not a problem with tobacco as much or alcohol, but they're dealing with it. How do you restrain behavior in an intelligent way? Impaired driving, well, how do you deal with that? So those are tricky issues to deal with. Gun rights, you have to demonstrate that you are a law-abiding citizen, that you have a capability of handling a gun in order to get a gun, just as you have to demonstrate that you have the capability of having a car to get a driver's license. And same-sex marriage. Well, marriage is not just liberation, it confers responsibilities and restraints on your behavior. If you take it seriously at all, and I think the same-sex marriage people do. And that's, I think those are interesting developments of how America, that I was born into, mid-century moment, was a conformist America where 16 million men and some women had been in uniform, where you were supposed to behave in an average, normal way, where there was social disfavoring of people who were different in some ways. We're a different sort of country now. We have many niche preferences. Despite our political rhetoric, most people seem to be able to live together in pretty things. You have big disputes about, campus speech codes and things on areas where 80% of the people are of one opinion. But when you go out to regular America, the suburban cul-de-sacs, people actually manage to live together. I went to look up the voting behavior of Scott Walker's suburb that he lives in, Wauwatosa, which is just outside of Milwaukee, in Milwaukee County. It voted 50% Obama, 49% Romney. It's just about the same as the country, slightly less pro-Obama. That means that on every street there are Republicans and Democrats. There are cultural conservatives and cultural liberals. There are people that go to a church some people consider wacky and other people behave beliefs about this and that. They manage to live together actually pretty well. I haven't seen culture wars break out with violence and guns in Wauwatosa or in the Wauwatosas of America. And we have more room for tolerating people that are behaving in different ways, as the opinions on same-sex marriage show, as I think you can argue the opinions on marijuana go, as a lot of different things are going now. I think that's libertarian, but with restraint. I think that's not a bad way to handle things. And I think that we had a little heated discussion here about campus speech codes and sexual assault things and so forth, and I recommended that the campus code that you need for behavior should borrow from the forward code of the KIPP schools, K-I-P-P, Knowledge is Power program. It's a really successful charter school movement. It's just started in Houston and New York, and it's around the country, operated out of San Francisco. but it's extended into America. No, it's a cheap shot. I'm undermining my own point. The four-word slogan of the KIPP group for the kids is, work hard, be nice. That's not a bad way for people to think about living. I think it's the way most Americans live most of the time. I think it might be a good way for campus people to think about living instead of imposing speech codes on people and trying to restrict people and punish people and pillory people who might be a little different from prevailing or loudly voiced opinion. So money in politics, it's always been there. You know, Vermont had this campaign finance thing. You weren't supposed to spend more than $10 on your state legislative race or something like that. I've got the facts, I kind of screwed up, but it was sort of like that. And this one candidate, they tried to disqualify her because she'd walked through her district and she had to resole her shoes. It was more than $10. Spent it on her campaign. You have to spend money to communicate with people. What's curious is that as we are in partisan preference to a considerable extent, so we are in money in equipoise. The last 3 elections, slightly more money was spent for Democrats than for Republicans in presidential contests. The difference was not great. It was similar amounts of money. There were recent headlines that the Koch brothers and their affiliated friends and so forth were going to spend $889 million. Well, you could run the same headline about George Soros and his friends spending $889 million for the left-hand side of the American political spectrum. I think there's a process argument that's disturbing if only one side can raise money. I think if both sides can raise money, and if a lot of special interests and people that are interested in medical marijuana or same-sex marriage or other issues that don't coincide precisely with partisan preference can also raise a lot of money on both sides. I think that's okay. I think that's a tolerable situation. I think attempts to try to regulate this too often get us into limitations of free speech, and I think that it's much better to take the risks of free speech than it is to get involved in censoring it. So I gather it's 8 o'clock, and I must conclude, but thank you for your attention and questions.